Thank you, President Niinistö, and welcome to this first Helsinki Security Forum. For everyone in attendance and those who are following us online, I hope this speech finally dispelled any myth that the Finnish political leadership wouldn't talk clearly, directly, and forcefully about Russia and the world around us, about our security situation. Now, since this is the first ever panel for the Security Forum here, major war returns to Europe. We've structured the panel into three parts. I am Charly Salonius-Pasternak, your moderator for the panel. I head the Center on U.S. Power and Politics at the Institute, as well as focusing then on Finnish Nordic security and defense issues. I don't have to tell anyone who's sitting here or listening to us about the events from this past year, how they continue to shape the European security environment. And let's be honest, none of you came to listen to the moderator here. If you're interested, I suggest you pick up the Helsinki Security Forum report, where me and a number of my colleagues have in very short text tried to open up our thinking on this matter. But let me tell you a little bit about the panel. So, philosophers, military strategists, politicians have for millennia talked about war, politics, sometimes talking only about war and ignoring the societies and the politics behind it. When we started organizing the Helsinki Security Forum, it became very obvious that we had to have a panel on major war. This means we'll be hearing analysis from different perspectives, different angles, and at different levels. The way the panel is set up is in three parts. First, we're going to hear Finland's Defense Minister Kaikkonen give his views, followed by a couple of questions. And unfortunately, he then has to leave. Second, we're going to hear a pre-recorded video from NATO's Deputy Secretary General, Mircea Geoană. And then third, we're going to invite a panel of practitioners, politicians, researchers. In fact, all of our panelists have experience in these different fields. So, Defense Minister Kaikkonen has already also been deputy of the Grand Committee in the Finnish Parliament. He's also been the chair of the Defense Committee. He has a master's degree from University of Helsinki in Social Sciences. And most important for most Finns, he's also a captain in the reserves. Minister Kaikkonen, take it away.
Thank you, especially for that most important thing. President of the Republic, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the Finnish Institute of Foreign Affairs for organizing this first ever Helsinki Security Conference. Much has indeed happened in Europe in recent times, and I'm sure there's need for reflection and northern perspective in this era of rapid changes. I will begin with a few words about the changed security environment in Europe. We are in a crossroads in history, where we find that the paths once traveled no longer take us forward. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an unjustified attack against a sovereign nation. It is a full-scale invasion. It is fueled by imperial sentiments bent on the destruction of the Ukrainian people and their identity. It is something we hoped would never take place in Europe again. Never. There are wide repercussions for European security. It affects the way we think about our defense in the coming years. It is not so much something completely new as it is a return to the way we used to think about security. The theme for the following panel discussion is Major War Returns to Europe. What we have witnessed is a very concrete and actually very conventional war. On the practical level, Russia's invasion is about territory and control of land mass and cities. It's certainly not the high-tech and cyber war of the future, as some would have envisioned a few years ago. There have been cyber operations, but they have not made significant contributions in the battlefield. The same applies to assumed prevalence of electronic warfare. Instead, we have witnessed a massive deployment of ground troops, of tanks, and heavy use of traditional artillery fire. Perhaps the saddest part is that Russia wages war against the civilian population and civilian infrastructure in a way that echoes the darkest days of the last century. The goal of Russia was to capture a nation, or even worse, deny its existence. Ukraine has defended bravely and managed to deny, perhaps even to derail this goal. However, it is clear that Ukraine depends on foreign aid to maintain its defense in the conflict, which is rapidly turning into a war of attrition. In 2022, there are only a handful of countries that have been preparing for this kind of prolonged conflict in which thousands and tens of thousands of shells are fired every day. As a consequence, we in the West are now having to look into possibilities to ramp up the production of military equipment and ammunition. It may not be easy, but it is necessary. It is important for our own security, but also critical to us who are committed to helping Ukraine. The role of defense industry was also one of the main points discussed in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group led by Secretary of Defense Austin in Ramstein earlier this month. Prolonged war takes its toll on defense stockpiles, and on this we have to act together and act decisively. Few words from the Finnish perspective. The war that is now being fought is in many respects like the one Finland has been prepared for during the last decades. We have maintained a credible national defense which builds on general conscription, a trained reserve, and high will to defend one's country. International defense cooperation with our partners has been a key part in strengthening Finland's defense. Finland relies on a doctrine of a comprehensive territorial defense, in other words, defense of the whole country. As stated in the government's white paper on defense, updated actually just a year ago, the aim is to prevent the use of military force or threats of military force against Finland. If deterrence fails, the military attacks will be repelled. It was out of the need to strengthen this deterrence and to take further steps to guarantee our security that we decided to apply for NATO membership this spring. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few miles from here, on the Suomenlinna Fortress Island, there is a quote inscribed in stone that says, "Stand here on your own foundation and do not rely on foreign help." Finnish people are very familiar with this quote. In the past, we have had to prepare to defend ourselves, in Churchill's words, if necessary, alone. We have wanted to stand on our own foundation by maintaining a strong national defense. In the near future, as a NATO ally, Finland will be able to rely on foreign help, and our allies can rely on us. So a new mindset is needed. Joining NATO is a historic step for Finland. However, this will not mean that we will abandon our foundation. We continue to take our defense seriously and to invest in it. Finland's membership will strengthen the alliance and support the stability of the region also in the future. The Finnish concept of security is more than military defense. It also encompasses critical infrastructure and overall societal resilience and preparedness. Earlier this week, we witnessed a suspected sabotage in the energy infrastructure of Europe in Nord Stream pipelines. This kind of hostile activity against the critical infrastructure is something that we have to be prepared for. We also have to know how to protect the civilian population and keep the wheels of society running despite any disruption. Security of supply in energy, in food, in medicine is also critical in the event of crisis, let alone war. This preparedness contributes to a strong resilience in the time of crisis, manifested in the well-known phrase, keep calm and carry on. The part of keeping calm is, of course, that comes very naturally to us Finns. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, we live in a turbulent time. The war being fought in the heart of Europe puts us all in a new situation. We must be ready to defend our democratic values, human rights, and way of life. And we must continue to support Ukraine as they are defending theirs. We follow the fate of Ukraine's occupied regions with great concern. No illegal so-called referenda will change the maps. They remain part of Ukraine. They remain the part of Ukraine. In order to be successful, we have to step up to the challenge of those who have no regard of international law or rule-based order. We need to think comprehensively about our security and work together in order to navigate in the changed security environment. I'm very confident that this first Helsinki Security Forum opens up possibilities for discussion and shared understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Kaikkonen. I'm glad you mentioned this quote. We'll, of course, be traveling to Suomenlinna, and I will point out the place where it is. But it's also important because it highlights this cultural change. I believe the most important change as Finland goes from we alone to we with others. With a view to NATO membership, what do you think are or constitute the advantages of Finland's system? What is it that Finland, do you think, can contribute and bring to NATO, considering this defense system, which is comprehensive?
I believe that joining NATO is a win-win situation. It's good for Finland, it's good for Sweden, it's good for NATO as well. Well, after the Cold War, quite a number actually of European countries made major cuts to their defense and, for example, left the conscription armies and other decisions. We didn't here in Finland. I'd say our approach to defense has been of pragmatic realism, and of course we know where we are located. We know our geography, and that has meant, for example, sticking to this conscript army, having good operational capabilities, be that artillery, air force, or navy, and our capabilities, I'd say, are quite good, and we've been investing for it also during these times more. But I'd say that one of the most important things is the will to defend our country. And this will is very high in Finland. Actually, it ranks one of the highest, not only in the Nordic countries, or not only in Europe. Actually, it ranks one of the highest in the whole world. I think this is something really important for our defense. And actually, I think that's also one reason it's high also in Ukraine. I think that's also one of those reasons why Ukraine has been so able, quite well been able to defend their country. If I remember right, when the question has put like, are you ready to defend your country militarily, even if the result is uncertain, 84% of Finns say, yes, we are ready. And that's really high number. And I always like to discuss about fighters and artillery and so on, but this is something which is of utmost importance for us. And I think it's good for a new NATO member as well.
I wholeheartedly agree, and all of my experiences talking with and participating in reserve exercises confirm this. People are more than happy to take time out, not only during the exercises, but before and after to work on this. You've touched on this, and much has been written in the international media about Finland's preparedness, including for major war. Yet after Russia's expansion of its war against Ukraine, the Finnish government decided to add to the defense budget quite significantly, to buy more stores, increase reservist training by about 50%. Could you talk a little bit about the Finnish defense budget? What will it look like in the near future? What might it be used for? Because globally speaking, Finland seems to get an incredible amount of capability for still, in absolute terms, a fairly low amount of euros.
Well, we are not any military superpower, but quite strong in any way. And that's because of that we've invested for decades to our defense. And also during the past few years, for example, investments to our Navy, we are replacing 7 older warships with 4 corvettes, which are now under construction in the city of Rauma. And of course, the biggest investment is of course replacing our present F-18 Hornet fleet with the new ones. So we made this decision in December, actually, last year's December. So we are we will procure 64 F-35 fighters. And after the war started in February, we decided of extra funding for our defense. The list is quite long. I'd say generally it's about fulfilling our storages, but it's about billions more to our defense. And actually, overall, our defense budget for next year will be about 6 billion euros. And we will fulfill the criteria of NATO of 2% of GDP next year and also in the coming years. And actually this 6 billion euros next year, it's also the all-time high of our defense budget. So there's also something about that we do take our defense seriously.
All right. Thank you, Minister Kaikkonen. We could continue this conversation all afternoon, but I know you unfortunately have to go. Thank you, and if I could have a round of applause.
Thank you.
So, I don't know about any of you, but does it feel a little bit like the boss has just left the Christmas party and now we can start the real conversation? Okay, maybe it's just me. Anyway, second part of the panel now. Speech by the Deputy Secretary of NATO, Mircea Geoană. He served as the president of the Romanian Senate, president of the Social Democratic Party. He was also a candidate for the presidency. He has been Romania's ambassador to the US, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and has degrees from NI in Paris, as well as the University of Bucharest, and a PhD in world economics.
Thank you, Charlie. And the Helsinki Security Forum is an excellent addition to the discussion on European and global security. And I'm very happy to speak with you today. I'm only sorry I cannot be with you in person. As you know, these days we are witnessing a disturbing deterioration of our security environment, which has changed radically since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia a few months back. We've seen conventional and unconventional risks and threats multiplying, and the strategic picture becomes ever more complicated, and a new European architecture unfolds. The damage to Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, which occurred just a couple of days ago in international waters in the Baltic Sea, is of deep concern as the leaks are causing risks to shipping and substantial environmental damage. All current information indicates that this is the result of deliberate, reckless, irresponsible act of sabotage. And we support the investigations underway to determine the origin of the damage, and allies have been exchanging information, including with Finland and Sweden, in this sense. We are committed to prepare for, deter, and defend against any coercive use of energy or other hybrid tactics by state and non-state actors alike. This comes in the wider context of President Putin's brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine, which also has reached a turning point. Is more than an attack on an independent sovereign country. It is an attack on the international system that has kept our nation safe for so long. We're also seeing the sham referenda coming into force. We'll not recognize them and will continue to stay by Ukrainian friends for the long haul. Speaking of Ukraine, since February, NATO allies have provided billions of euros worth of weapons, ammunition, and other support to aid Ukraine in its just fight for freedom. This is on top of the support we have been giving Ukraine since its independence in the 1990s, and especially since 2014. And we will continue our support for as long as it takes. Russia's war underlines just how vital a strong deterrence and defense is. Russia is weakened, but still dangerous. And we cannot let down our guard. We cannot assume it will not attack another country. Many assumed that it would not launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine from the beginning. They were wrong. This is why Finland and your neighbor Sweden took the historic step to apply for NATO membership. To seek the protection of Article 5, when an attack on one ally is an attack on all of us. NATO membership will make Finland safer, and Finland will make NATO stronger. Finland in particular brings huge expertise when it comes to national resilience, lessons that are deeply embedded within its society since the end of the Second World War. More widely, having allies on all sides of the Baltic Sea will change the strategic environment in the region and make the defense of the Baltic countries easier and the whole North more coherent. Your membership will change the configuration of what we know as NATO's eastern flank, now stretching, with the accession of Finland and Sweden, from the Barents Sea to the Mediterranean, to the Baltic and the Black Seas, and a significantly longer border with Russia. We must reflect this new reality in our policies, especially initiatives that focus on transport, communications, that enable greater military mobility and readiness. So things like the Three Seas Initiative and the North-South Corridor become even more important. On the security and defense side, the need to ensure readiness also translates in better interconnectivity and eluding all obstacles for military mobility and the movement of people within our community. In addition, you have, as Finland, you have deep partnerships with many countries in Asia and Africa and the developing world. You have a sterling reputation. Your diplomacy is first act. Your support and aid has changed destinies for the better in so many places. So you bring to the alliance not only your strategic depth, your armed forces, your society, but also your reputation and your expertise. And this is something that all of us in NATO and in the world will benefit from. So Finland and Sweden will make our alliance stronger, more resilient, and more integrated in the world around us. 20 allies have already ratified your membership, and I'm very much looking forward to welcoming you into our alliance very soon. Russia is the most significant and direct threat to Allied security. But it is not the only challenge. Terrorism, instability, China, disruptive technologies, climate change, all threaten our interest, our people, and our values. We must be strong and we must be agile if we are going to continue to keep our people safe. To guide us, we have the new strategic concept agreed by our leaders at the NATO Madrid summit last June. And the concept reflects the far darker reality we face today. It reaffirms our values, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, what the Washington Treaty is based upon. It also states that our main purpose and greatest responsibility is to enable our collective defense, to deter and defend against any threat from any direction. We do this with highly capable forces at a high state of readiness. Since 2014, we have deployed battle groups in the east of our alliance. Now we are significantly increasing the numbers of troops, equipment, quality, and multi-domain presence in the eastern flank. Today, as we speak, there are more than 300 soldiers by next year ready to move at short notice to respond to any contingency to protect every ally. So our role has changed, and so has NATO. And will continue to change to keep our people safe. And of course, we need to do this with partners. And of course, the European Union is the natural partner for NATO. In recent years, NATO and the EU have taken this partnership to new heights. We work together on a growing range of issues, from the Western Balkans to military mobility, from maritime to cyber defense. Neither NATO nor the EU alone have the tools to ensure our security and our prosperity. But working together, we are a powerful force for good. And a key area for cooperation with the EU is creating stronger societies. And as I said before, we can learn many lessons from Finland. Modern conflict is about far more than guns and tanks. We must be every bit as concerned with the protection of our critical infrastructure, including energy security, supply chains, healthcare systems, and resilient societies, which are, in fact, our first line of defense. Strong societies are better able to deter, resist, and bounce back from attack, be they physical or digital. This requires ever closer cooperation with the private sector. NATO depends on a thriving private sector for the capabilities we need, from weapons and ammunition to satellite or cyber defenses. Our societies also depend on industry to keep them running and keep them secure. We are driving this relationship through increasing spending commitments and through new instruments like the €1 billion NATO Innovation Fund and Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. Because leveraging the pool of talent we have in the soon-to-be 32 nations is paramount in keeping our technological edge in the era of great power and fierce great power competition. We have the best academic institutions in the world. We have the finest researchers, the most creative companies, and the best minds. And in free societies where people can challenge and question everything, we have a significant advantage in the development of new technologies and in experimenting and innovating and designing and co-designing a better future for us and for our societies. One word on energy security. We have been too dependent on Russian oil and gas for too long. This is changing rapidly. This is also difficult. We have to be sincere and honest. This is not an easy transition. This is going to be a difficult couple of months ahead of us. But this is something that we need to do. And I know that after these difficult moments, we'll be stronger together with a better economic, development, and environmental model in Europe, less dependent on blackmail and energy wars like Russia is waging against us, and also an invitation to diversify energy supplies and not be dependent and vulnerable to coercion like we have been for so many long years. Also, we have to make sure that we help Ukraine. We have to help Ukraine not only in defending its right to be a sovereign, independent nation and to choose whatever future they want to choose, but because this is something which is very, very important, not only for Europe, it's also important for the rest of the world. And we have to defend, like Finland has done in your glorious history, to defend every inch of our soil, but also to make sure that we convince the rest of the world that being part of a democratic, rule of law based and democratic future is the best way forward. All the best of luck for your conference. The North is becoming very, very important. The changes and climate change will bring new challenges and opportunities to this part of Europe and of the world. And now we can count on Finland as a dear new allied member in NATO to give us the kind of sophistication, depth, and contributions that we know we can count from you. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Mircea. And now for the third part of our panel.
Thank you, Charly.
I'm going to introduce the panelists.
And the Helsinki Security Forum.
We're going to start with Pavlo Klimkin. He served as Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs 2014 to 2019. Prior to that, he had about 2 decades of experience at the ministry working on disarmament, nuclear safety, energy security issues, so everything we need to know and understand today. He was also the chief negotiator for the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and has served as Ukraine's ambassador to Germany. He's earned a master's degree in physics and applied math and worked at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, so a true scholar too. Please join us up here. Yep. And next, we're going to have Dr. Andrew Michta. He's the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, non-resident fellow at the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative in the Atlantic Council. Holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. And he was also a professor at U.S. Naval War College. I'm going to have to read all these because it's impossible to remember this many affiliations. Rhodes College. He's been a research fellow or leader at Stanford, George Washington University, CSIS, CEPA in Washington, German Marshall Fund in the United States, and Woodrow Wilson International Center. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. If you can take
Okay.
one, yep.
Thank you.
And then we have Anna Wieslander. She's the director of Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council and concurrently the Secretary General of the Swedish Defense Association and is a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. She was also previously the Deputy Director of our sister institute, UI, in Stockholm, as well as being Secretary of the Swedish Defense Commission and Deputy Director of the Swedish Defense Ministry. She holds an MA degree from University of Lund, where she's also working on her PhD. So again, a practitioner and a scholar. Welcome, Anna. Thank you. Before I let all of you start or give you the word for 5-minute introductory comments, could I have just a quick reflection from each one of you about what you've just heard, either from the Deputy Secretary General's speech or the previous ones? Anna.
Well, I heard a lot of interesting things, but one thing that struck me with President Niinistö's speech was that he said that dangerous times must not lead to paralysis. I think that's really important, to act decisively and to move on. He said to know when to hurry, know when to be cautious or have patience. But I think this is really, really key. And then, of course, for Defense Minister Kaikkonen's I think that this to stand on our own foundation, but now also to stand together with others. Since I'm Swedish, I think this, for these two non-aligned countries, this would be perhaps the biggest shift. We can talk a lot about what we can contribute, what kind of capabilities and so on, but we must not forget that this is a mindset, and not only for the military or not only for the politicians, but also for the people. I think this will be a big task for both of us.
All right, thank you. What, Andrew?
Thanks. I think the most important thing for me was what President Niinistö said, that Finland has never been naive about Russia. I mean, I find it striking that every time I visit Finland, there's a very clear sense of realism, and at the same time, the appreciation that geography is what it is and that Russia will remain your neighbor. So that sense of realism, that sense of determination, and also the sense of self-reliance. I was also very impressed by what the defense minister said about the defense spending, not only meeting the NATO 2% target, but I'm tracking your acquisition programs as well, and they're extremely impressive, from the F-35 on through a number of other assets. So delighted to be here.
Thank you. And Pavlo.
Well, in a way, we understand each other. I mean, Ukrainians and Finns, because of our history, because you fought this war against the Soviet Union. And we have to prove Russia and Putin wrong, and simply show that with the real support of the West, we can win this war. And it's a fundamental point for the West, for the Western credibility, and of course a point of survival. What I've missed is the way forward. And I of course understand that talking publicly about it, it's a sort of difficult drive, but still we need a kind of bold thinking, I would say. What should come next? And I'm gonna talk about it in a couple of minutes. One point I both agree and disagree with Antti, and it was a very thoughtful and very good chat, like the one by the president, is actually his definition of our war against Russia as a 20th century war. Well, yes, the firepower is still important and critical. But in the sense how we use drones, software, coordination, it's probably a kind of test for the 21st century. So it's fundamentally different, and we are, in a way, at the beginning of a game changer for the whole history of the future military. But it's just a sense of where I believe we already make a breakthrough. But otherwise, these two were quite good in the sense of supporting Ukraine, but here again, it's what I've missed is a real sense of way forward.
All right. We at the end will have some suggestions on the way forward, and I agree that there's probably things that many militaries can learn in terms of flexibility and resilience that we've seen the last months. Why don't we continue with you?
Look, it's of course good to be in front of the crowd of friends, and thanks for standing with Ukraine. It does not sound like a platitude. It does not sound like a slogan for us. Let me map out just 3 simple points to push our today discussions. One point, Putin so far, from everything I can judge and from everything I know, has not changed his goals on fundamentally ruining Ukraine as such, as a country, as a nation, as our history. There is a very deeply sitting sense of mission in his mind and his vision of Ukraine as artificial reality. The reality is the other way around, but you can't, wherever rational or not rational, prove that he fundamentally understands the reality wrong. He just had a speech talking not just about Ukraine, but blaming the West on everything. And the president, a couple of minutes ago, said very clearly, we are not in the conflict with Russia. You are definitely not in military conflict with Russia, but after the last escalation, after his sham referendum, after Nord Stream 2.1 and Nord Stream 2 blown off, simply ask yourself whether you still would like keep refusing the simple point. You are not in a military conflict, but you are in a conflict. And Putin was talking for 15 minutes about his conflict with the West. Basically blaming West on everything, on blowing Nord Streams, on killing Russian philosophers, on everything. Just read his speech and you understand. Okay, hopefully you understand his mind. Now talking to many people, it's amazing. Many people, saying me, Pavlo, why didn't you tell us all before? And my point was basically, I told you in 2008 that the next should have been Crimea. And I remember all these political consultations in Germany. I actually remember quite well the Chancellor Merkel starting the whole exercise with Nord Stream 2 in 2015, after the Crimea, whatever. So my point, we are in a completely different situation. We are in a new phase of what's going on, in the sense of our war against Russia and in the sense of Putin's perception where we are. My second point. Because you were teasing me up in a friendly sense, of course, that I'm a physicist by education. And many years ago, one of my professors told me a joke about Einstein teaching in the Zurich University, and he distributed different tasks. And one student raised his hand and said, but professor, these are the same tasks you gave us 2 years ago. Einstein said, fine, but the answers are different. So my second point, the answers are fundamentally different. If you follow this strategy more of the same, it's gonna be our failure, but it's gonna be your failure, Western failure. So what is your answer? And I'm gonna say a couple of points on how I see it in the future. What is your answer to what Putin is doing? A bit more weapons, a bit more sanctions. So what else? And you have to confront these fundamental points. We are talking about hard choices. They are indeed hard choices. But more of the same for me is not an answer. It's a fundamentally wrong approach in everything we could take further. And my third point, because I'm more than aware of this 5 minutes burdens, but it's an important one. Any sort of idea to put the whole reality in Ukraine in a real attrition war, in a kind of classical war, and I hate this definition of classical war, but still. And to say in some moment in time, it's gonna come to negotiations, they're gonna be difficult, and everyone has to make concessions, but because of all kind of challenges, you have to make it. And the good point from Antti about not to rely on foreign assistance, and we are indeed dependent on your assistance as allies. I mean, not as partners, but as allies. It's a fundamentally different situation. But even if someone is somehow breeding this idea and he's in her mind, don't do it. It's really my point. We have now the first army in Europe. We can handle any weapons. We can handle US, Swedish, French, German, whatever. You know, how many people in this room can handle anti-tank weapon? I can now, after sort of training. So we have 1.1 million people now trained, including police, including everyone else. And millions of Ukrainians, it's really my point. Even if someone wants to impose any sort of concessions on us Ukrainians, we'll fight on. And this is exactly the point where the whole Pandora box gonna be open and the hell will be upon all of us, because us Ukrainians, we are not like others. We are good technically. We understand drones. We understand a lot of things, and we will fight on. So my point: we need a fundamentally new strategy towards Russia. What does it mean to have deterrence with Russia now? It's all gone, you know, all kind of old definitions. What does it mean to have a balance with Russia? What does it mean actually to tackle this Russia? And how are you able and are you going to live together in this, on this planet with Russia? They are all very, very simple points, but we have to confront it. If we try to evade it, we are fundamentally nowhere. And let me stop here, and I'm gonna add up a couple of points how I believe we can basically shape up not all, but at least part of the real strategy towards Russia later.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm hoping soon enough we'll hear some ideas from the audience about what this new approach, fundamentally new approach towards Russia could entail. And there's hopefully a few people here also that can maybe even promise for their government a little tanks or fighter jets or things like that. But let's go now to Andrew.
Thank you. And let me preface my comments by saying I'm speaking in my private capacity as an analyst and not on behalf of the Marshall Center, the Defense Department, or the US government. These are my private views. Makes the conversation more interesting as well. I would like to make 2 points. One, that in my perspective, we're looking at this conflict as truly a system-transforming conflict, not just at the level of the European theater, but also globally. As you probably are aware, we've had this conversation in the US since 2012, since President Obama spoke of the pivot to Asia and then the kind of refocusing on Asia. And China remains this huge problem set for us. We talk about it as a pacing threat in our various documents. But I think this war showed very clearly that the United States is both the transatlantic and the Pacific power. That we are anchored in both Europe and in Asia. And I think wars have a tendency to verify and check a lot of theorizing and a lot of debates in policy community. And I think that's a very powerful message. The response from the Biden administration, the speed of that response, the determination, I think sent just the right message. The second thing I would say here from my perspective is that we are most likely kind of within 3 broad objectives when it comes to this conflict. First of all, I think it's clear the United States is committed to preserving and ensuring that Ukraine remains sovereign, that it can chart its own course, and that the Russian aggression does not pay. And I think this is something that we should keep in mind, because Russian victory in this conflict, in my view, would be a civilizational win. It would change the way Europe operates going forward. So it's not just state-on-state conflict. I think it's something much larger than that. Point number two, I think it's clearly vital that NATO remains politically unified. I mean, what this war has done, it's brought about a kind of unanimity in the political realm that not so long ago people thought was not attainable. We talked about regionalized security optics. Countries on the flank saw more of the Russia threat. Countries further west, like France, for example, would be more focused on Africa, the Mediterranean. Germany was trying to manage, in my view, the Russian relationship through economic and political means. So this fact that we have all come together, and I work in Germany, I live in Germany, listening to Chancellor Scholz deliver his speech, the Zeitenwende speech was truly, I think, something that has changed the entire focus of our conversation. And I think the third one, and I don't need to say this in Finland, is that we do not want this to escalate to an all-out war between NATO and Russia. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. So we are in this very complex, but I think at the same time a very clear policy environment of what we want to achieve. And Putin's threats of escalation, you know, what's happened in the Baltic with the Nord Stream pipelines, and this kind of constant sense of churn and instability is something that I think will require a very steady hand from us. Let me just conclude my introductory comments, because I think the Q&A will be more interesting than just making speeches. I think the outcome of this war will shape European security for decades, if not for generations. In political science, we talk about system transforming wars. This is, I think, one of them. The fact that the brave Ukrainian nation stood up and fought has already set in motion, I think, what the president of Finland just indicated is the question of the post-war security settlement and the structure that we're going to be living in. I remember, I think it was in 1993, Zbigniew Brzezinski famously noted that Russia that dominates Ukraine will re-embark on the imperial path. Russia without control of Ukraine can no longer be an imperial power. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but I think this is absolutely true. The near-imperial drive by Putin has been stopped in its tracks. This war is not over. I don't think this is something that's going to be resolved quickly. And I think that as this war unfolds and progresses, we will see the emerging foundations of the new security architecture in Europe.
Thank you, Andrew. Again, lots to think about also with regards to what Finland's and Sweden's roles and contributions to this systemic change or transformation might be. Finally, Anna.
Thank you. And I want to first just thank FIIA for the invitation here and praise you, I think, for arranging this kind of forum in this kind of time. I think that this would be important not only for Finnish foreign policy, security policy, but for the whole Nordic conversation that we are having. And I'm happy to be part of it. So thank you. In preparing for this, I was just recalling my elderly mother calling me this summer, and she said, Anna, you have been working extremely hard these past months, but things are only getting worse anyway. Why don't you take vacation? So, since you always should listen to your mother, I did. But we are here now anyway on this horrible historic day, I think, in a way that we see that Russia is claiming illegally even more regions from Ukraine. But even if things are getting worse, I think it's important to have a look at the lessons learned, what we can see so far. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and there are things that we can learn from this, paraphrasing Mark Twain there. First lessons learned that I wanted to lift up, I think, is that Ukraine is part of Europe. And accordingly, if we stick to the vision of a Europe whole and free, Ukraine have to be part of that. And I emphasize that because I think it's important to be honest. And before the war, there was quite a lot of hesitation, I would argue, in capitals around Europe, whether Ukraine actually was fully part of Europe, or if we were frankly comfortable in having Ukraine a little bit on the edge, a little bit in between, and not having to take decisive steps, as President Niinistö pointed at. And I think we have to acknowledge that it was not until the Ukrainians demonstrated that they would fight for their freedom, for their democracy with their own lives, that we realized that Ukraine is based on the same values system, the same community as we are in the established Europe. And the fact that President Zelensky led the way by refusing to go in exile, that he stayed with the people in Kiev, to my mind, that was one of Putin's actually first major miscalculations. But it was not only Putin's miscalculation, it was also a miscalculation from us in the West. And we had to kind of shift pretty quickly and change the way we looked at things. And I think I want to point at this because it has implications not only for Ukraine, but for other areas that are contested space that are part of Europe and would be part of Europe whole and free. That's Moldova, that's Georgia, that's Western Balkans. And I think with this regard, further EU enlargement and the NATO open door policy are really crucial instruments to work with ahead. The second lesson learned, I think, is the indispensable role of the United States for European security. And I'm not saying this only because I represent the Atlantic Council, but I say it because it's a fact. From the sharing of massive intel, from the warnings of an invasion during the Russian troop buildup, to political push to get through tougher economic sanctions. We remember the nightly calls from President Biden to, for instance, Italy's Prime Minister Mario Draghi in the spring, the beefing up of NATO as a deterrence measure. We have now over 100,000 American troops here, to be compared to 30,000 in 2015. That's just one example. But then, of course, most importantly, the support to Ukraine. Had the figures in August, but it's the same now, that the US gives by far the most militarily, economically, and humanitarian support to Ukraine in absolute terms. Only EU institutions give more financial aid, but EU institutions and all EU member states combined give less total aid than the United States. And so we have to see this with clear eyes if we talk about European security. You can draw many conclusions of this, but it's clear that NATO, then, which is the transatlantic kind of instrument for the US, in sharp contrast to Mr. Putin's intentions, is stronger and more attractive than ever. And I think that the fact that Sweden and Finland has abandoned their long-term security policy to apply for NATO membership is just one sign of this. NATO is the framework in which European defense and deterrence will be strengthened. NATO, not the EU. And I think we need to have a very pragmatic approach here in order for this to work ahead. The role of the EU when it comes to defense is mainly to serve as a vehicle to jointly develop capabilities that are of use identified within the NATO framework. And this is the way we have to proceed. It is an important point ahead. Thirdly, and lastly, I make the same point as the President and as Andrew has done. Unity is the strongest weapon of the West. And that's also why Russia targets this repeatedly over and over again. In my interpretation, what happened in the Baltic Sea this week is just another of those attempts to shoot at our unity this time when it comes to energy security. Of course, you had the Russians themselves commenting that this affects the energy security of the whole continent. Well, yes, it does, but it also plays on the fear that this will happen during the winter and the risk of lack of unity. It's a test of our resolve, but it's also a warning that Russia is still capable of power projection elsewhere and not completely preoccupied with what's going on in Ukraine. So unity is our biggest challenge, but it's also our greatest accomplishment so far. And the unity to stand with Ukraine and to explain to Europeans and Americans that there is a cost for peace, also for us, and that we should be willing to pay it. I think that's really crucial ahead, and that goes not only for Europe, but for the whole transatlantic community. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And you started with saying something which now maybe seems obvious, but had you said it even a year ago, you would have gotten far more pushback. Ukraine is a part of Europe. And I think that's a fundamental change in how many people, including in Finland, see things. Now, I'm assuming there's a whole host of questions from the audience, so I'd like to, in fact, take a few at a time. That way, if there's a question aimed at only one of our panelists, everyone can participate in it. I may know a chunk of you at least, but please introduce yourself and give us your affiliation for the benefit of the panelists as well as those following online. Who wants to start? All right, I see one hand right here.
Thank you, Charlie. Is this on? Yes. Okay. Minna Olander, I'm a research fellow at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. And my question goes to the whole panel, because Germany was mentioned, and I was thinking of this mantra that there was for decades, that there can be only security in Europe with Russia, not against Russia. And if you ask the Poles or the Baltic states, it's pretty much the opposite. They have always been seeking to find security against Russia. So these are quite fundamental, maybe disagreements in a way, on how, when at some point going forward, a future European security architecture will look like. So I would like to hear your views from your respective perspectives, like how can this be reconciled in a way? How to find a way to keep Europe unified and also more generally the Western Alliance? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll start with changes in perspectives. I'm expecting more hands, but let's answer this then first.
Well, I think in a way, you know, when you listen around in Europe, Eastern Europeans would say, "We told you so," and others would go, "Yes, okay, there is really something on this. Can you have security with Russia, or do we have to focus on security against Russia?" And it is a balance of power problem to start with. But to my mind, I think that we have to be honest in this. To have a security order which is focused on how we strengthen order within what I call Europe, and then again including some of those who are not fully part yet, and being aware of that we need to deal with Russia as something that we balance against to keep a regional order which does not include them. I think that's the right way to go, but that is not to say that there are not avenues for dialogue with Russia. Of course, I mean, China is not part of the European security architecture, but of course there are still paths to dialogue with Russia, with China, for instance, and you will always have it with Russia. But to build security we have to be honest, what we tried to build after the end of the Cold War, the whole, all European security architecture, where we all sat around the table, all discussed, that was only possible because there was trust in between us. And when there is no trust, when you have an aggressor or attempted aggressor, that is not possible to have as a working cooperative order. you have to find other structures. And I think that's what we need to aim at, to be realistic. But that does not mean complete containment or lack of communication.
Thanks for the question. It's absolutely central. So I've got relatives in Tennessee who like to say, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging, you know. Europe has been digging itself into a hole on hard security for over 2 decades now, if not longer. I mean, we really have to appreciate the extent of the European disarmament and the lack of capabilities as a result of what has been happening. You know, the assumptions that hard security no longer is at the top. Every time I travel from the Baltic states or Finland, Poland, Romania, there's a very keen sense that they're bordering on Russia, and there's a memory of Russian behavior. And then, of course, if you look at every single time when Putin used military power, he got away with it and he scored geopolitical wins. 2008 Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, 2015 Syria, and this was supposed to be yet another case of that. So I think to start digging yourself out of this hole, I think that there has to be a real commitment to put real exercised military capabilities into the field that then, you know, SACEUR can tie with this operational planning together. I hear a lot about the 2% target. You know, some countries claim they'll do more than that. I've always been skeptical of that because to me, you know, you can spend 2% on defense, but if 80% of that goes to personnel costs and your Air Force is non-deployable and the rest of it. This is not a conversation about Finland, but there are a number of NATO countries that find themselves in that situation. Remember that the United States is facing a real storm potentially brewing in the Indo-Pacific, right? And so I look at the Sino-Russian cooperation or alliance, in effect, alignment, whatever you want to call it. It was an attempt to create a two-front crisis for the United States, one in Eastern Europe and one in the Indo-Pacific. So if Europe does not take upon itself the responsibility to provide the core of conventional deterrence in Europe, and if need be defense, with, of course, the United States present, with our nuclear umbrella, with our high-end enablers and the rest of it, I think Europe will miss this very important opportunity to return NATO to what it should have been. You know, NATO has been kind of coasting on fumes a little bit during the counterterrorism phase and you know, out-of-area operations and whatnot. We're now coming back to what the alliance should be, which is deterrence and defense, the primary function of this organization. And that brings the key question of Ukraine. We're talking about, you know, EU enlargement, getting Ukraine into the EU, you know, the process has started. But the primary issue is security. The primary issue is how Ukraine fits into the architecture of European security. What is its relationship going to be to the alliance? These are the tough questions we have to take on. Because if you want to talk about economic investment, you know, talk to the business people. They're not going to start pouring money into the war zones, right? So Ukraine has to be secure. Ukraine has to have a relationship, you know, it's earned that place. It is now, in effect, as Pavlo said, you know, it's got arguably the most capable European military, maybe after the United States in Europe. I would make this little caveat here, but it's battle tested. It's shown itself to be able to operate, you know, cross domains. It has just demonstrated that it can maneuver and do all sorts of other operations. So we need to have this conversation if we look at the architecture. To me, the biggest headache, and I'll conclude on this, is how do we keep the alliance united going forward? Because it's one thing to make political statements, but nations live in neighborhoods. So if you look at the response of the Baltic states or Poland, right, they're very close, they're on the frontier. I would argue there is a different level of appetite for risk-taking within Europe. And I think we need to maintain that consensus because if we break that unity, then Putin will get what he wants. He will get the ability to play one country against the other. And finally, two questions: rearmament, and secondly, you cannot have energy policy disconnected from national security priorities. I think we've learned that lesson, all of us right now. This will be a tough period, I think, for the Europeans going forward. And this political unity, and that's why I keep saying we need to have governments get to the level of a dinner table conversation with the citizens. You know, that's the level at which we need to explain what's at stake. Europe doesn't have enough munition stocks. It doesn't have redundancies. If you look at the consumption of ammunition in Ukraine, you know, how long could European armies, you know, some of them at least, be actually operating in the field under these conditions? So all these lessons have to be absorbed. And let's be realistic, because of how deeply that process of disarmament in Europe reached, it'll take years to rebuild it. But again, you find yourself in a hole, stop digging, start moving forward again now.
Thank you. Anna, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that, because I think you can look at it in a two-phase building right now. Building on what Andrew said, you know, we focus now on our institutions. The strongest we have are the EU and NATO. We build bigger defense, better deterrence. That's also things that we can do. This is in our hands. When we have that, we will be stronger towards Russia, and the offense will be less of an appetite for Russia. Therefore, there are bigger, therefore I see that in the next step, if you want to talk about cooperation with Russia, which is important for some European states, I think you have to see it this way. Where we have this ongoing war, when we have this preparation, where we have nothing, not much to get from a dialogue with Russia, we can still build ourselves and focus on strength. And that will give us a better position when things on the ground have changed, not only for Ukraine, but for the whole of us.
Thank you. And we're going to actually, if we take question here first, I'm sorry, then here in the middle, and then I saw a cluster of hands there. If I can ask everyone to be brief, also on the panel, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. I'll be very brief. Boris Ruger, Munich Security Conference. I have a question for Pavlo. You spoke about the need for a fundamentally new strategy vis-à-vis Russia, and I'm sure you're right. And one reason I think you're right is that Russia after this conflict will not be the same as going into this conflict. So what kind of Russia do you expect? And can you tell us a little more about what that strategy should look like that you're calling for?
Thank you. I'm going to take you here. And of course, feel free to ignore the questions you don't want to answer.
Juhana Vartiainen, Mayor of Helsinki. This is a continuation on Minna Olander's question. She asked about reconciling the old German position with the Eastern European Baltic position. My question on Germany is a follow-up, more descriptive, positive one. What is the German position actually? To a casual observer like myself, there seems to be an ambiguity. Does Germany want to commit in this conflict with heavy weapons, or is there a fundamental confusion there on where the country wants to go, security and foreign policy-wise? Thank you. Right. This is perhaps mostly for Professor Michta, who talked about this Zeitenwende talk of Chancellor Scholz. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll take one more question back there.
Thanks very much indeed. Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations. Also a question on Germany. Andrew, you mentioned that Chancellor Scholz's speech had indeed announced some form of real change. What does real meaningful change looks like, actually? What puts the Wende into Zeitenwende? Thank you.
And I will just remind everyone, we will have a panel that will address these questions in further detail, so.
Okay, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government. I'm definitely not speaking on behalf of Germany, but let me make a couple of points. First, to the second question, what does this look like? 100 billion. 100 billion euros spent on defense that Germany committed to providing. That's a real, tangible, visible evidence of change. So, You know, look, I remember a few years ago when Germany was not even going to look at the F-35 as an aircraft to compete for the 5th generation platform and was going to develop it with France. Germany's buying the F-35. Germany's buying the heavy helos. I mean, there's a clear indication here to me that something's changing. I've been often frustrated with the kind of 1 step forward, 2 steps back conversations. But I tell you one thing, this is a change of not just policy, this is a change of strategic culture in Germany. And I say this as a great friend of Germany and looking at how critical it will be for Germany to move forward in that direction. It's not just the question of the size of the German economy, it's the geostrategic location. Most of US legacy installations, military installations are in Germany. Any reinforcements of the flank have to factor in the assets that we have there. We could just go on and on and on and on. We will probably have a very severe test in Germany this winter, depending on what the energy situation is and how the public will respond to that. And that's probably true across Europe, because everybody is pretty much in the same boat because of the energy policy that literally made Europe dependent on Russian gas. Now, just 3 days ago, I believe Germany announced that it will not decommission 2 of the 3 remaining nuclear reactors. That's also indicative, I think, of how serious Berlin is about this situation. Will the German public see the intensity of the threat the same way as the Finns, the Poles, or the Estonians do? Probably not, because they're not the flank country. But Germany is the key member of NATO. And I think, you know, I think it was Reagan who said trust but verify. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about watch the changes in the German body politic, where the German public opinion is. And we are coming out of 3 decades of strategic culture where we assumed that major state-on-state war in Europe is not possible. And we have seen that this has all changed, actually. And also we have to understand how important Putin's narrative of the last 20 years has been. Putin's created a narrative that the great Russian Imperial Army or Soviet Army was never defeated. You know, it was betrayed from Gorbachev through Lenin, through drunken Yeltsin, whoever you wanted, you know, to bring to the fore. That's why what the Ukrainians are doing is so critical, because the defeat of the Russian military in Ukraine breaks that narrative. And I think the Russian public must understand that that is exactly what's happening. They're trying to fight a Soviet-style war without the resources of the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation is not what the Soviet state was in terms of its resources, population, not to mention 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions that they controlled.
All right. Thank you. Let's hope Germany also finds the tanks from somewhere. Pavlo.
Well, I've been posted to Germany twice, once as a young diplomat in the 90s, and after that as ambassador. And my simple point to the Germans was, look guys, you can't imply that the same politics should be realized towards the Brezhnev USSR in the 70s and to Putin's Russia. So the people were saying, yeah, Pavlo, maybe, but still. And now Zeitenwende is there, but the results of the Zeitenwende are still underway. And the role of Germany is absolutely critical. One point about your, Boris, question. 3 months ago, I came to Berlin and said, look, guys, in the sense of all these discussions about security guarantee, you will come to the point where you're gonna place NATO troops on the Ukrainian territory. There is no other way around. Like my old friend, okay, he's too old for me, but Henry Kissinger once said, Ukraine should be considered now formally or informally as a part of NATO. You can play with formalities, and Vladimir Zelensky, as I understand, a couple of minutes ago, formally addressed NATO to get NATO membership on a special procedure, but at least informally, you will come. That it's just the only option. There is no other way around. And 3 months ago in Berlin, they told me, look, Pavlo, yeah, maybe you're a smart guy. Almost all your predictions are fine, but you are totally crazy. Let's wrap up our lunch and discuss something else. And of course, but my point is very simple. Ukraine is the only chance for Europe and European Union to become global player. Point. There is no other chance. Otherwise, Europe is where Europe is fundamentally now. Even the decision to grant Ukraine the candidate status is geopolitical because never ever any country got candidate status in the time of war. In 2003, in Thessaloniki, the Western Balkans have been granted such status after the war. And for me, the point, the answers are if, like Andrew has absolutely rightly said, I can't agree more, if you believe it's a sort of transformational war, and after this war, there are going to be a new security system, you can't follow, and it was my point, more of the same policy. It's over. Just forget about it. So there should be a fundamentally different approach. And my last point, because you've mentioned all this, and Putin, I pretend to understand Putin's mentality. I negotiated with the Russians pretty much everything, gas, arms control, Normandy, and look, I studied in Moscow many years ago. It was still USSR. You can talk to the Russians and you can talk to Putin, but only and ultimately from the point of strength. You can talk to people like Putin, who is KGB guy. He's not a military guy. He sees the world as a sequence of special operations. So he's a KGB guy, and after that he managed all kind of organized crime in St. Petersburg as a deputy mayor. So he has kind of fundamentally different mentality. The only way to talk to such people is from the position of strength. To talk to the position of strength, Europe should become a real geopolitical, and it's your choice, the hardest one. Either you understand that the costs of becoming a geopolitical player is something you are ready to bear, or you are nowhere. And it's the choice which is now, which is not the choice for tomorrow and after tomorrow, and I'm very serious about it. And what Finland actually has done with the NATO membership is part of this choice, is a part of this pattern. So fundamentally, you will confront this choice very soon. Very soon with Putin raising the stakes and with others raising the stakes. Because in the 90s, one of my friends told me, okay, the Chinese kids were playing with others. And a couple of years ago, he came to me and said, Pavlo, somehow the kids of my daughter wanted to play in the schoolyard with the Chinese. And the Chinese said, no, just go away. It's about a different sort of China. It's China for us. So it's a different set of mentality. And either you are ready to get prepared for it, or you make an educated decision to stay low-key, not playing any game, and fundamentally going down in the 21st century. And it's not in any way or a sort of exaggeration.
Thank you. We have some serious choices. Before I give you the floor, I'm just going to say we're going to have one more round of questions. No questions on Germany. Something else, just as a warning.
Just very quickly, I wanted to, as I was listening to Pavlo, this transformation of European security architecture is fundamental in another way. Ukraine that's democratic, successful, secure, all but ensures that I cannot imagine Belarus remaining on its current trajectory. There's no one country solution to the security dilemmas on the eastern flank. It has to be a regional one. And remember that it's been 30 years since the end of the Cold War. A new generation of Belarusian men and women has grown up under these conditions with the sense of statehood and the kind of strengthening national identity. The fact that these young men and women were in the streets while they were being beaten by Lukashenko's goons to protest the stolen election. A thriving free Ukraine is an example that I think would make it just a matter of time before you would also see a change, a democratic change or a transformation in Belarus. And that changes the entire security equation along the flanks, in my view.
Thank you. I'm going to take two questions. One up here, thank you. One, I saw a hand back there. And just so you can prepare, at the same time, you can give any final reflections as you answer the questions.
Thanks very much. Jessica Berlin, visiting fellow at GMF, promised not to ask about Germany. So in the context of all these remarks about European unity and our long-term need to rise as a security power, a very immediate term question, especially in the face of Putin's speech this afternoon, what in your minds should be the minimum response from NATO if Russia deploys a nuclear weapon in Ukraine?
Deploys what?
A nuclear weapon.
I saw a hand earlier there. Okay, all right. Well then, as I can actually read, watch and see we're running out of time. I will be dragged off the stage soon. I will finish with one question. Now, the panel's been pretty somber, which, if we're talking about major war, is rather unavoidable. But I'd like to ask all of you, and everyone in the audience, whether or not sitting here or online, can hopefully come up with something of their own answer, maybe ask someone else later in the evening what their answer is. Now, it's too early for us to know what will come, but if each one of you were given the responsibility to design future European security order, what would it look like? What would be the key pillars so that we and future generations could avoid the scourge of war?
What do you want to start? Okay, go ahead.
Again, the only way is to become a real player, to start talking to the guys like Putin from the position of strength and basically bridging to your point, what could be a sort of reaction if Putin further raises the stakes. It's a very simple answer. Both the US and the European Union, and we need fundamental solidarity here, proclaim Russia country sponsoring terrorism, which would mean that anything in the sense of links from other countries, including China or India to Russia, should be sanctioned. If China is not going on board, or India not going on board on a price cap for Russian oil, it's sanctioned. So fundamentally, start not just directly sanctioning Russia, but sanctioning others who help Russia. And Russia is done. It's not just about more of the weapons. It's not just about more of the sanctions. Just change the whole horizon. There could be a number of other steps I would probably refrain from discussing publicly. Yeah? But the answer is crystal clear. The only point whether you have political will to start pulling it off.
Thank you. Andrew.
What would this security architecture look like? The fact that Finland and Sweden are joining the alliance transforms the entire flank. It's not just the length of the frontier. It's essentially the whole stretch from the high north, Norway, Sweden, Finland, defense of the Baltic states, which, as you remember, was always kind of debated in the policy community, is actually not an iffy proposition anymore. You're talking about a reconfiguration of the entire area. with Ukraine in that security architecture, and again, we can talk about what the specifics should look like, you're talking about a revitalized NATO alliance. I think people that, you're looking at nations that understand what the security threats were. Everything depends on what happens to Russia. I mean, what is the impact on Russia politically of a military defeat in Ukraine? And what kind of forces would this unleash domestically? Would Russia, in fact, begin to come to terms with the reality of what it means to be a normal state, quote unquote, and not an empire constantly on this quest that we have seen? These are truly the great unknowns that will shape European security. And again, because I'm looking at this from the American perspective, what happens in the Indo-Pacific in the next 4 or 5 years, I think, will be critical. I think the Chinese are watching very carefully, not just the performance of Russian weapons against Western weapon systems, because a lot of their designs are actually drawn from that pool, but they're also probably calculating what the power equation is going to look like after this war, reaches its denouement. I think Russia will emerge as a result of this war, not only weaker, but more dependent on China. So Putin has inadvertently accelerated the process of vassalization of Russia vis-a-vis China. Now, the risk, of course, is if the Chinese decide to use their industrial base to supply the Russians with weapons. I mean, I think that would fundamentally change the entire tenor of the conflict. As to your question about the response, I think that would be such a game changer that it would force, I think, a very fundamental reassessment on the part of Western powers in terms of how we have approached supporting Ukraine and aiding Ukraine. And I think here the key capitals all over Europe and the United States would have to make a decision as to what kind of a response that should be. And I suspect that it would be two-pronged. I think it would be both assistance to Ukraine directly on a much larger scale even than what we have seen so far, and then probably some response from NATO. I also think our Indian friends and our Chinese friends would have something to say on that subject, because that would be breaking the mold of everything that we consider to be, the thresholds of what's permissible in this behavior, and this kind of fence sitting that you see sometimes in a number of countries when they look at Putin, that would be forced into a resolution. Is it possible that he may resort to this? I would never put anything past that man, but I think the likelihood of that being imminent still remains relatively low, despite his bluster and his threats and everything else that he says.
Thank you very much. And I know we're blinking red, but I most certainly want to hear what Anna has to say. What should the future security architecture look like?
Well, to me, it's clear that it will build on the institutions that kind of have passed the test here. I think that's both, it's NATO, the broader framework, and it's the EU. I would expect, as I sketched, them to be even larger and stronger in a few years through the enlargement and open door processes that we can pursue. I don't see why we shouldn't do that. We will have to deal with Russia, but Russia will not be part of this order. Russia is in decline, and whatever comes after will be weaker. I agree with Andrew. I see also Russia and China not in an alliance, but aligning on each other, because that would be in the interest of powers that size in a world which we will be facing.
All right. Thank you very much. And that brings this first panel to an end. May I please ask everyone to give a great round of applause to the panelists. Thank you also to our online audience. I'm glad you could be with us. Please join us again tomorrow. The stream will now end.